Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The old telephone rings, but no one's there. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Silent Arrival. The town of Maplewood was nothing like the bustling city Claire Thompson had left behind. Tucked away in the northeastern woods, it felt more like a place lost in time, a quiet mix of old Victorian houses and the occasional modern home, all surrounded by thick, looming trees. The kind of town where everyone knew each other, and strangers were met with curious stares. Claire's car crunched over the gravel driveway of her new home, a towering, weathered Victorian that stood like a sentinel at the edge of the forest. It was the kind of house that seemed to breathe with the wind, its wooden frame creaking as she stepped out of the car. The house had been in her family for generations, passed down until it had landed in her lap after her aunt's passing. But despite its grandeur, it exuded a sense of abandonment, as if it had been waiting for someone like her to return. Claire, still reeling from her recent divorce, saw the move as a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life away from the painful memories that haunted her. As she unlocked the front door, it groaned in protest, revealing a dim, musty interior filled with old furniture draped in white sheets. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost palpable, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves outside. After a few hours of unpacking, Claire ventured up to the attic. The narrow staircase groaned under her weight as she ascended, each step feeling like a descent into another world. The attic was a dark, cramped space filled with relics of the past, old trunks, faded photographs, and an assortment of forgotten belongings. But what caught her eye was an old rotary telephone sitting on a dusty table in the corner. Claire frowned. It was a relic, completely out of place in a house without a landline. She picked it up, brushing off the dust, and set it down with a shiver as a cold draft swept through the attic. Just as she turned to leave, the phone rang. The sudden sound made her jump, echoing eerily in the stillness. She hesitated, heart pounding, before lifting the receiver to her ear. Hello? Nothing but static and faint whispers, like distant voices carried on the wind. Claire pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it in disbelief. A chill ran down her spine as she traced the cord, expecting to find an outlet. But the cord disappeared directly into the wall, with no sign of any connection. She tugged at it, but it wouldn't budge, as if it were a part of the house itself. With a shaky laugh, Claire told herself it was just an old phone acting up, a prank by some bored kids, or perhaps her mind playing tricks after a long, exhausting day. But as she descended the stairs, the echo of the ring lingered in her mind, and the whispers seemed to follow her every step. Chapter 2. The Voice in the Night. Claire couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her since finding the phone. Even after she tried to immerse herself in the mundane tasks of unpacking and settling in, the memory of that eerie ring and the strange whispers clung to her. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the isolated house, her nerves were already frayed. The wind picked up as night fell, howling through the trees that surrounded the property. The old house seemed to come alive in the dark, groaning and creaking as if protesting the encroaching storm. Claire tried to convince herself that it was just the house settling, that the noises were normal for a place this old. But the whispers she'd heard over the phone replayed in her mind, making it impossible to relax. She finally drifted off to sleep, buried under layers of blankets in the chilly bedroom. The house, despite its age, felt strangely cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and left you shivering even under heavy covers. Claire's sleep was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of static-filled phone calls and shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision. In the dead of night, Claire was jolted awake by a sound that sent her heart racing, the phone ringing again. The shrill tone cut through the silence like a knife, filling the room with a sense of dread that made her skin crawl. She lay there, paralyzed for a moment, hoping it was just another dream. But the ringing persisted, each chime more insistent than the last. Claire forced herself out of bed, her feet cold against the hardwood floor as she made her way to the attic. The house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in as she climbed the creaking staircase. The attic was even darker now, the single bulb casting weak shadows that danced in the corners. The phone sat on the dusty table, ringing incessantly. Claire's hand trembled as she picked up the receiver and brought it to her ear. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, there was only the familiar static, crackling like a distant fire. But then, a voice emerged from the noise, distorted, distant, but unmistakably calling her name. Claire. The sound of her name, spoken in that warped, otherworldly tone, sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. The line went dead, leaving only the sound of her own breathing echoing the silence. Claire dropped the receiver as if it had burned her, stumbling back from the table. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely think. What the hell was happening in this house? She hurried back to her bedroom, locking the door behind her as if that could keep the terror at bay. But even in the safety of her bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Claire tried to rationalize its stress from the move, the lingering grief over her divorce, the exhaustion of the past few days. Maybe she was just imagining things, her mind playing tricks on her in this unfamiliar place. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The next morning, with the sun casting long rays of light through the windows, the terror of the night before seemed almost unreal. But as she sipped her coffee, Claire couldn't help but search online for any history about the house. What she found was unsettling rumors and vague accounts of strange disturbances, whispers of the place being cursed. The previous owners had left abruptly, refusing to talk about why. The phone rang again, faint and persistent, the sound echoing in her mind. Claire knew she had to get to the bottom of this, no matter how terrifying the truth might be. Chapter 3: Unseen Forces. The unease gnawed at Claire, growing stronger with each passing day. The phone's ominous rings had become a nightly occurrence, the voice on the other end more demanding. It was always the same, her name, distorted and chilling, followed by silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Sleep became a distant memory, her nights filled with restless tossing and turning, haunted by nightmares that left her drenched in sweat. In the harsh light of day, the terror felt less real, like the faded remnants of a bad dream. But the dread lingered, pushing Claire to seek answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, Claire decided to visit the town's small library, hoping to uncover more about the house and its dark history. The librarian, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a penchant for silence, led her to the dusty archives without a word. Claire combed through old newspaper clippings, the faded ink barely legible on the yellowed pages. It didn't take long for her to find what she was looking for, an article detailing her aunt's death. The circumstances were vague, only stating that she had passed away in her sleep, alone in the very house Claire now called home. But it was the subtext that caught Claire's attention. Neighbors had reported hearing strange noises in the nights leading up to her aunt's death, faint, eerie voices that echoed through the woods surrounding the house. As Claire read on, a pattern began to emerge. Other articles hinted at similar occurrences, always centered around the old Victorian house. A string of mysterious deaths, unexplained disappearances, all linked by the same unsettling detail: No one ever left that house without something following them. Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Was she destined to share the same fate as those before her? The thought was too horrifying to entertain, but it clung to her, whispering in the back of her mind like the voice on the phone. It was then that she met Ethan, a local historian who often frequented the library. He was in his late 30s, with a kind face and an inquisitive nature. Claire, desperate to make sense of what she'd uncovered, confided in him about the strange phone calls and the disturbing history of the house. Ethan listened, his skepticism evident but tempered by curiosity. "I've heard the stories," he admitted, his voice low. "But most people in town dismiss them as old wives' tales. Ghost stories to scare children. Still, there's always a kernel of truth in these legends." "What if it's not just a story?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "What if there's something in that house? Something dangerous?" Ethan frowned, considering her words. "If there is, you should be careful. Some things are better left alone. The past has a way of trapping those who dig too deep." But Claire was beyond caution. She was consumed by a need to understand, to unravel the mystery that had taken hold of her life. The voice on the phone wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was trying to tell her something. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to the truth. That night, the phone rang again, the sound more insistent than ever. Claire, filled with a mixture of fear and determination, picked up the receiver. This time, the voice was clearer, sharper. "Claire, come home." The words sent a chill through her, freezing her blood. The voice wasn't coming from somewhere distant. It was inside the house, as if it were part of the walls, the very structure that surrounded her. Claire knew then that there was no turning back. Whatever haunted this place, whatever secrets it held, she was going to find them no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The Past Resurfaces. The phone's chilling words echoed in Claire's mind as she wandered the house, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the old windows, deepening the sense of dread that had taken root in her. Sleep had become an impossible luxury. Her nights were filled with the relentless ringing of the phone, the voice on the other end growing more insistent, more commanding. Each call brought with it a new wave of terror, leaving her frazzled and desperate for answers. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Claire remembered Mrs. Harlow, the elderly woman who lived a few houses down. She was one of the town's oldest residents, a living archive of Maplewood's history. If anyone knew the secrets of the old Victorian house, it would be her. Claire resolved to visit Mrs. Harlow, hoping to uncover something, anything that could explain the horror that had gripped her life. The next morning, Claire made her way to Mrs. Harlow's home, a quaint little cottage surrounded by a meticulously tended garden. The old woman welcomed her with a warm smile, but there was a knowing look in her eyes, as if she had been expecting this visit. They settled in the parlor, the scent of freshly brewed tea filling the air. Mrs. Harlow's hands, frail but steady, wrapped around her cup as she listened to Claire's halting account of the strange occurrences in her house, the phone calls, the voice, the ominous warnings. When Claire finished, Mrs. Harlow sat in silence for a long moment, her gaze distant, as if lost in memories long buried. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "The telephone," she began, "has been in that house since it was built. No one's ever been able to remove it, no matter how hard they tried. It's as much a part of that house as the walls themselves." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. But why? What is it connected to? Mrs. Harlow sighed, setting her cup down with a soft clink. The house's original owners, the Ralstons, were a wealthy family who moved here over a century ago. They had a daughter, Emily, a sweet girl who was the light of their lives. But one day, she vanished without a trace. The whole town searched for her, but she was never found. The Ralstons were devastated, and the house, well, it changed after that. Claire leaned in, her breath catching in her throat. What happened to her? No one knows for sure, Mrs. Harlow replied, her voice tinged with sorrow. But there were rumors, whispers, something dark that took her. The Ralstons left town shortly after, but the house was never the same. People say it's cursed, that it holds on to the pain and grief of those who've lived there. The weight of Mrs. Harlow's words settled over Claire like a shroud. The voice on the phone, the cryptic warnings, it all pointed back to the tragedy that had unfolded in that house so many years ago. Voice, Claire said, her voice trembling. It keeps telling me to make it right. What does that mean? Mrs. Harlow's expression grew grave. I don't know, dear. But I do know this, whatever happened in that house, it left a mark. And it won't let you go until you find out what really happened. The phone calls became more frequent after that visit. The voice now demanded that Claire make it right, the tone growing colder, more threatening with each passing night. Claire's fear had morphed into a desperate need to uncover the truth, but with each step closer, her grip on reality seemed to slip. She heard the phone ringing even when she was away from the house, its shrill tone piercing through her thoughts like a jagged knife. She felt eyes on her wherever she went, a constant, oppressive presence that made her jump at every shadow, every unexpected sound. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, and she began to wonder if she was losing her mind, if the house's dark history was consuming her just as it had consumed those before her. But there was no turning back now. Claire had to know the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. Descent into Madness. The storm hit without warning, a violent assault of wind and rain that shook the house to its very foundation. The power went out just after dusk, plunging Claire into darkness. The howling wind and the constant battering of rain against the windows amplified the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the house. She fumbled for candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls, making the familiar rooms feel foreign and menacing. The old rotary phone on the hallway table rang out, its shrill tones slicing through the storm's roar. Claire's heart lurched with each ring. She had been expecting it, dreading it, but when the moment came, it still sent a jolt of fear through her. She approached the phone slowly, her breath hitching as she lifted the receiver to her ear. "Find the truth," the voice hissed, no longer distorted but clear and menacing. "Before it's too late." Claire's mind reeled. The voice was different now, more forceful, almost angry. It demanded something from her, something she couldn't understand but felt compelled to discover. Her pulse raced, her thoughts spiraling as the storm outside intensified, rattling the windows and sending gusts of wind through the cracks in the old house. Suddenly, the line went dead, replaced by an ominous silence. Claire dropped the receiver, her hands trembling. She backed away from the phone, stumbling into the living room where the shadows seemed to dance around her, alive with unseen presences. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her as she struggled to distinguish between reality and the horrific visions that began to flood her mind. Claire saw flashes of the past images of the Ralston family, their faces twisted in grief as they searched for their lost daughter. She saw Emily, the little girl, her face pale and haunted, reaching out to her from the darkness. Then, the vision shifted, and Claire was watching her aunt, alone in the house, her expression one of abject terror as the phone rang and rang, its sound reverberating through the empty rooms. The boundaries between the past and the present blurred until Claire was no longer sure if she was living in her own time or reliving the horrors of those who had come before her. She saw herself in the reflections of the windows, but her face was not her own. It was Emily's, staring back at her with hollow, accusing eyes. "Find the truth," the voice whispered, now inside her head, relentless and unforgiving. "Make it right." Claire's grip on reality slipped further with each passing moment. She stumbled through the house, the visions coming in waves, disorienting her until she could no longer tell where she was. The storm outside raged on, a mirror to the tempest within her mind. When Ethan arrived, he found the house in darkness, the front door ajar, rain blowing in across the threshold. He called out to Claire, but there was no answer, only the eerie creak of the old house settling around him. He ventured inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom as he searched for her. He found Claire in the living room, huddled in a corner, her eyes wide and vacant. She was muttering to herself, her words incoherent, but the terror in her voice was unmistakable. Ethan knelt beside her, trying to coax her back to reality, but she was far gone, lost in a world of shadows and voices only she could hear. "The phone," Claire whispered, clutching at Ethan's arm with surprising strength. "It won't stop. The voices. They're angry. I have to find the truth before it's too late." Ethan's skepticism faltered as he looked into her eyes, seeing the raw fear that had consumed her. He glanced around the darkened room, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as a cold draft swept through the house. Something was terribly wrong here, something beyond his understanding. He could feel it now, pressing down on them both, an unseen force that filled the air with a palpable sense of dread. But as Ethan tried to pull Claire back from the brink, he realized it might already be too late. Whatever haunted this house, whatever secrets it held, had claimed her, and there might be no saving her from the darkness that had taken hold. Chapter 6: Revelations. The storm outside had finally abated, leaving the house in an eerie silence. Claire sat in the dim glow of a single candle, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Ethan had left to get help, but Claire had remained behind, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain. The phone's voice had grown increasingly frantic, urging her to find the truth, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay hidden somewhere in the house. The oppressive silence was broken by the sudden ring of the phone, its shrill sound jarring and insistent. Claire jumped, her pulse racing. The voice, now desperate, pleaded with her. "The basement? You must go to the basement. It's the only way." The words seemed to echo through her mind, compelling her to act. Claire's heart pounded as she made her way to the basement, the darkness swallowing her as she descended the creaky stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of mildew and decay filling her lungs. She reached the bottom and fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. No flicker of light, only the cold, stifling darkness. Groping along the wall, Claire's hand brushed against a wooden panel that felt different from the rest. Her fingers worked the panel loose, revealing a hidden door. With a deep breath, she pushed it open, revealing a narrow, musty room lined with dusty old furniture and forgotten relics. Claire stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The room was filled with old photographs, yellow documents, and strange artifacts, everything belonging to the house's original owners. Her eyes were drawn to a large, ornate chest in the corner. She opened it, revealing a collection of old journals, their leather covers cracked with age. She found one journal that seemed different from the rest. Its cover was marked with strange symbols, and as she opened it, she was greeted by the scrawled handwriting of the house's original owner. Her hands trembled as she read the entries, each word pulling her deeper into the house's dark history. The journal described a desperate and tragic pact made by the original owner, a father grieving for his lost daughter. The man had attempted a ritual to bring her back from the dead, using dark, forbidden rites to summon a malevolent spirit. But the ritual had gone horribly wrong. Instead of bringing his daughter back, He had inadvertently trapped the spirit in the house, bound to it by the power of the old rotary phone. The spirit had been trying to communicate ever since, its rage and sorrow growing over the decades as it sought someone to complete the ritual and release it from its torment. Claire realized with a shudder that the phone had been its conduit, a way to reach out and manipulate the house's occupants, desperate for someone to finish what had been started. The voice on the phone grew more frantic as she pieced together the truth. "You must complete the ritual," it urged. "Free me or suffer the consequences." Claire's mind raced as she grappled with the revelation. Completing the ritual meant risking the release of the malevolent spirit, potentially unleashing a force far more dangerous than she could imagine. But destroying the phone could curse her and anyone else who dared to live in the house. She stood in the hidden room, the journal clutched in her hands, feeling the weight of her decision. The house seemed to close in around her, the walls vibrating with the trapped spirit's anguish. Claire was caught in a moral quagmire, knowing that every choice she made could have dire consequences. The phone rang again, its tone more desperate than ever. Claire knew she had to make a choice, and the weight of the decision pressed down on her, as cold and unyielding as the darkness that surrounded her. Chapter 7. The Final Decision. The house loomed in the encroaching twilight, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the dying light. Claire stood on the threshold, her heart a tempest of fear and determination. The storm had passed, but the shadows seemed to cling to her, as if the house itself was aware of the decision she was about to make. The journal's revelations weighed heavily on her mind as she prepared to confront the malevolent spirit that had tormented her. Claire had gathered the necessary items from the journal: candles, herbs, and an old, tarnished silver dagger. Each item was essential for the ritual, each step a part of the complex procedure to either free the spirit or doom herself to its wrath. She set up the ritual space in the basement, the room still heavy with the musty scent of old memories. The phone, now silent, sat ominously on a dusty table, a constant reminder of the darkness that had gripped her life. Her hands trembled as she arranged the candles in a circle, the flickering flames casting long shadows that danced along the walls. Claire's resolve was tested with each step, her fear clawing at her insides. The spirit's voice had been relentless, its desperation palpable, but she knew that finishing the ritual could either release the spirit or unleash an even greater horror. As she worked, Claire couldn't escape the gnawing realization that the spirit had been feeding on her own grief and loneliness, a parasite thriving on her suffering. The isolation she had felt since her divorce, the sorrow of losing her aunt, it had all played into the spirit's hands, amplifying her fears and weakening her resolve. But now, standing at the precipice of a decision that would define her fate, Claire found a newfound strength. She had to end this, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been affected by the house's dark legacy. With the ritual's preparations complete, Claire took a deep breath and began the incantation from the journal. The words felt foreign and ancient on her tongue, each syllable reverberating through the cold, heavy air. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, her breath visible in the dim candlelight. The house responded violently. Objects began to move on their own. The old wooden beams groaned, and doors slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The phone rang again, its sound piercing and frantic, as if it were begging her to hurry. Claire's pulse quickened, the noise growing louder and more insistent, pressing her to finish before the house succumbed to chaos. Shadows writhed and twisted around her, the spirit's rage manifesting in the turbulent energy that filled the room. Claire's heart pounded as she completed the final steps of the ritual. Candles flared wildly, their flames battling against the encroaching darkness. The voice on the phone reached a crescendo of desperation, pleading with her to finish it. Claire's hands shook, but she forced herself to stay focused, driven by the knowledge that her actions in these next moments would determine the outcome of her ordeal. As the ritual reached its climax, the house seemed to hold its breath, the supernatural activity intensifying. Claire fought through her fear, the weight of her choice hanging heavy in the air. She could feel the spirit's presence all around her, a dark and malevolent force trying to hold on to its last shred of power. In that moment, Claire understood that the outcome was no longer just about her. It was about confronting the darkness that had plagued this house for generations and putting an end to its torment once and for all. Chapter 8. The Unending Echo. Dawn broke with a feeble light, casting a pale glow over the house's worn exterior. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside drenched but calm. Inside, however, the atmosphere was heavy with an unsettling silence. Claire stood amidst the remnants of the ritual, her body trembling as she surveyed the scene. The candles were burned down to stubs, their wax pooling around her feet. The house was eerily still, the oppressive weight of the night's chaos now replaced by an uneasy quiet. Claire's heart pounded as she reached for the old rotary phone, which had finally gone silent. Her mind was still reeling from the ritual's culmination, the incantations and desperate pleas echoing in her ears. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to hope that the spirit had been released. But then, the phone rang once more. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. Claire's hands shook as she picked up the receiver, her eyes wide with fear and anticipation. She brought it to her ear, expecting the voice of the malevolent spirit, but what she heard instead froze her blood. "Claire, help me." The voice was hers. It was her own voice, repeating the same desperate pleas she had heard countless times before. Tone was filled with anguish, a haunting echo of her own fears and desperation. The realization crashed over her like a wave. The spirit had not been freed. It had twisted the ritual into something far worse. Claire had become part of the house's curse, doomed to relive the horror eternally. She was trapped in a loop, her own voice the only companion in the endless cycle of terror. Her knees buckled as she sank to the floor, the weight of her new reality crushing her. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the walls echoing with the whispers of her own torment. The room felt smaller, the shadows closing in, as if mocking her futile struggle against the dark forces that had ensnared her. Claire's despair was palpable as she wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing eerily in the emptiness. She was drawn back to the basement, to the hidden room where she had uncovered the dark history of the house. Everything was the same: the relics, the journal, the oppressive darkness, but now it was all part of her unending nightmare. The phone rang again, its sound a cruel reminder of her fate. Claire reached for it, but this time the room was empty. The phone continued to ring unanswered, as if the house itself had claimed her voice. The echoes of her own pleas reverberated through the house, mingling with the ghostly whispers of the trapped spirit. The sun rose higher, its light struggling to penetrate the gloom of the house. Claire remained in the shadows, a spectral figure bound by the curse. The phone's relentless ringing was a chilling reminder of her eternal torment. The story ends with the phone's shrill cry filling the empty house, a haunting and unresolved reminder that the terror will continue long after the book is closed. The chilling truth remains. The horror of the house is not confined to the pages of the story, but lives on, echoing in the silence, waiting for its next victim.